for some vintage video. Nearly 35 years ago, manager Pete Rose arrives in Houston as Major League Baseball investigates whether Rose bet on baseball and possibly games involving his own team, the Cincinnati Reds. And now there is a new book on Pete's rise and fall, a story of addictions and secrets, recklessness, and many missed opportunities for salvation, as the publisher puts it. And now it's Keith O'Brien, the author of this book, and how Houston plays a role. Keith, I know you grew up in Ohio. Was that really the foundation, the driving force to produce a work on Pete Rose like this?
Well, it was part of it. I am born and raised in Cincinnati originally, and although I moved away long ago, I have thought a lot about Pete Rose. And one thing that really pushed me to write the book is that I feel like in the last 35 years, since Pete was banned from baseball and as he's made mistake after mistake off the field, that we've really forgotten why we ever cared about him in the first place. And I think that's true of baseball fans. I think that's true of most people. And so what I wanted to do with the book was go back and tell this whole story. The story of this rise and this fall, and sort through the wreckage of it, because there is a lot of wreckage, and I do think we are still sorting through it today.
You use that term wreckage, and I think in our time that we live in now, we try to condense everything into something understandable and quick and short. Was there a point of no return for Pete Rose during his career, his life?
I think it was the lies that hurt him the most. Based on my reporting, if Pete Rose had been honest in 1989 about what was happening in his life, the narrative does go differently. In February 1989, Pete Rose is called to New York for a secret meeting with outgoing Commissioner Peter Ueberroth, incoming Commissioner and current then National League President Bart Giamatti, and Bart Giamatti's deputy and good friend Fay Vincent. And they want to talk to him to find out if the rumors that they've heard are true. Has he been gambling on baseball? Has he been gambling on the Reds? And based on my interviews with the folks who were there that day and the investigators who would come later chasing Pete Rose, if Pete is honest that day in New York and tells them what is true, yes, he's been betting on baseball, and yes, he's been betting on the Reds, and yes, he has a gambling problem, a gambling addiction. The whole narrative is different. And I don't mean to suggest that Pete Rose would not have been punished. He would have been punished. And he may still have faced a permanent banishment. But I don't think that it would have been the sort of banishment or a punishment that we would still be wrestling with 35 years later. Because one thing we have forgotten is that just as the current gambling scandal in Los Angeles involving Shohei Ohtani and his former interpreter, Ippei Mizuhara, is bad for baseball right now, the Pete Rose scandal was bad for baseball in 1989. And if there was anything that Bart Giamatti and Fay Vincent and others could have done to try to salvage the situation and perhaps get Pete to admit what he had done and seek redemption, everyone absolutely would have done that.
Are you surprised how Pete has reacted to the Shohei issue?
Not surprised at all. I was almost waiting for Pete Rose to inject himself into the story. He couldn't resist. He finally did. As many people know now, he released that viral video days ago now in which he said, "I wish I had had an interpreter in the 1970s and 80s. I would have been off scot-free." And it's a great line. It's a funny joke. The video served its purpose. We're talking about it. It did go viral. But the thing is, Pete Rose effectively did have interpreters in the 1970s and 80s. He very rarely interacted with bookies, especially by the mid 1980s, and especially in his bets on baseball. He often turned to his good friends, his inner circle pals, to do this sort of work for him. And in my research from my book, I spoke with many of these men. I did interviews with 3 different men who placed Pete's bets on baseball. And they too recognize the irony here. As one of them told me in a text just a few days ago, I guess Pete forgot that I was his interpreter in the 1970s and 80s.
I think the book gives a true insight about how these guys are wired, that they can have all this stuff going on outside the lines and still, for the most part, perform at a high level. Did you at all scratch your head during this and say, how is he able to be an all-star and to pursue a hits record and all the accomplishments while everything is in many ways blowing up around him?
Yeah, I didn't just marvel at that. His former teammates did too. Multiple players told me that they're just like everybody else. When they're having marital problems, when they're having financial trouble, they bring those problems and troubles to work with them, just as anyone else would. And they're there in the batter's box in the middle of the bat, and they're thinking about something else. Pete Rose didn't do that. And one thing that I tried to point out in multiple points along the way in the narrative is that several times when things are particularly unraveling for him off the field, his marriage falling apart, questions swirling about his gambling, meetings with officials at Major League Baseball about his gambling that come as early as 1978 based on my reporting. In these moments, Pete is having some of his greatest success on the field. In 1978, based on my reporting, there's some kind of intervention in Cincinnati, in the office of then president of the Reds, Dick Wagner. And the conversation that day is with Wagner, it's with Pete Rose, and based on my reporting, it's with at least one official from Major League Baseball. And they're worried about his debts to bookies. At that time, he is about to go on a 44-game hit streak. The longest hit streak that we have seen, by the way, since 1941, 44 games in a row with a hit. And, the same thing is true just 1 year later, right when his first wife, Carolyn Rose, publicly files for divorce. The first salvo in a war that will end this marriage. Pete proceeds over the next 5 weeks of the 79 season, the last 5 weeks of that season, to bat over 400 at the plate.
Houston plays a small role in the Pete Rose story in the sense that Joe Morgan is acquired by the Reds in a trade from the Astros. The picture you paint is that Joe Morgan, he wanted out of Houston badly.
Yeah, I would submit that it's not even a small role that Joe Morgan plays here. The Reds were a great team when Morgan was traded there in late 1971 and joined the Reds for the 1972 season. But I think many baseball historians would argue that Joe Morgan was the missing piece there. And yes, Morgan, while resistant to going to Cincinnati, no player really liked to be traded and have the carpet pulled out from under their feet. He was pleased to leave Houston for one reason. It wasn't because of the city. It wasn't because of the fans. He had a very contentious relationship with the manager of the Astros at that time, a man named Harry Walker. Joe Morgan was a young, talented Black player. And he was also incredibly well-spoken and outspoken. And Harry Walker, was an old school baseball guy. And he had some old school beliefs. Joe, in particular, believed he was deeply prejudiced against Black athletes and Black players. And one irony that I find significant to the Pete Rose story does involve Joe Morgan. When he gets traded to the Reds, late 1971, joins the team early 1972, there's no hint that Joe Morgan's going to be a future Hall of Famer and MVP. He was a pretty good to good infielder. And he had been labeled in part by Harry Walker's criticisms as a troublemaker. And by the way, this is a loaded term, when you look back on it now. That term troublemaker was often applied to players of color who didn't toe the line. And so I do find it ironic that when Joe Morgan joins the Cincinnati Reds clubhouse in 1972, that even the Reds are a little concerned about this reputation of Joe Morgan being a troublemaker. And indeed, Sparky Anderson, the manager of the Reds, asks the clubhouse attendant to make sure that Joe Morgan gets a locker right next to Pete Rose, so that Pete Rose can sort of show him, how to play the game and how to do things right. And by that time, Pete Rose is already placing bets with bookies on the west side of Cincinnati. Pete Rose is already forming relationships with gamblers that will bring him down 17 years later. But the concerns in Cincinnati are about their new second baseman, Joe Morgan.
You make it very clear early on in the book that Pete Rose was, for lack of a better phrase, cooperating with you and speaking with you, and then suddenly he cut you off. What do you think he would say to you today if he saw you now that the book has been released?
It's a great question. And, the short answer is I don't know. It was interesting, in writing the author's note of my book. I want to, give thanks to folks who have contributed and who did participate and were generous with their time. And Pete Rose did all those things. He granted me 27 hours of interviews in person and on the phone, a lot of time. And I did also spend a couple days with him out on the road at the signing shows that he goes to or the appearances he makes. And I don't know what happened. I don't know why he stopped calling back. And I don't know what he would say if I ran into him today and saw him again.
He is Keith O'Brien. The title is Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. Thanks so much for being on Sports Extra.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
And there's more to come from this Pete Rose book, as Keith will be in Houston on Tuesday at Blue Willow Books on Memorial Drive. The reviews of this book have been excellent, by the way, and I agree with them.